Hello and welcome to today's compliance conversation. My name is Jonathan Greenson. I'm joined today by two of my expert colleagues from Thistle Initiatives, Lorraine Moat, Head of Payment Services, and Anthony Corner, Manager within our Payment Services team. All of us at Thistle have been really excited for today's session, Mastering Interactions with the FCA. Now, why are we excited, you may ask? So, well, this is something firms keep telling us they find daunting, and we want to help ensure they are ready and prepared when the FCA do get in touch. Now, the FCA is responsible for overseeing and regulating financial markets and financial services firms. Its primary role is to ensure that financial markets operate in a way that is fair, transparent, and to the best interest of consumers. At present, I'm sure a lot of you know, the FCA is paying particular attention to the payment services in the industry due to associated risks with the sector and specifically around protection of customers in line with the new initiatives such as the Consumer Duty. It's imperative for firms to be compliant with the expectations of the regulator, both in terms of the protections to customers, but also that their business is robust enough to deal with bumps in the road. As part of this, firms should maintain a healthy relationship with the regulator, and interacting in the right way is a big step to achieving that. In fact, it is within the conditions of authorization for firms to be open and honest with the regulator at all times. Now, in this webinar, we're going to discuss how your firm should approach any interaction with the regulator to help initiate and maintain ongoing positive communication. We're going to look at some common scenarios which you see in our day-to-day interactions with our clients and consider some do's and don'ts for times when your firm may need to engage with the FCA. Now, I briefly mentioned earlier who will be joining our panel today, but I'd like to give them a chance to introduce themselves and their background. So, Lorraine, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. As Jonathan said, I'm Lorraine Moat and I'm Head of Payment Services. So I lead the Payment Services team, and we help support all firms within the payment services sector, whether it's an emoney firm or an authorised payment institution. I've been a consultant for a number of years, having worked in two previous consultancy firms, but prior to being a consultant, I actually was in industry. So I worked as Head of Compliance in one role, Head of Conduct Risk in another, and if I go back even further, still staying within the realms of financial services, I was more operationally based, sort of head of front office, back office type operations. So I've kind of got a nice sort of round robin experience, I like to think, and a bit of a broader exposure to the world of regulation, not just in payment services, which I think sets me up quite well to help support our clients. I will hand you over to Anthony now, who's one of the managers within my team. Anthony.
Thanks, Lorraine. So I joined Thistle relatively recently in March of this year as a manager in our payment services team, directly from, I guess, the team a lot of you on the call will have had interaction with at the FCA, the payment services and emoney team at the FCA, the supervision team. So I've seen kind of a lot of common pitfalls, some good examples of interaction, some bad examples of interaction with the FCA. And that's kind of what we're here to discuss and share today. So thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you. So, to briefly introduce Thistle, we are a specialist governance, risk and compliance consultancy that has been supporting the financial service industry for the last 10 years now. Our team of expert compliance consultants guide firms through the authorization process, provide ongoing support and advice to the full breadth of the regulated financial services industry, and help firms with the implementation of new and changing regulation. Before I jump into the questions that we're going to ask our panel here today, we've got two polls that we'd like to ask of our audience to gauge, firstly, to make sure everyone's awake on today's session, but also to get an idea of your interactions with the FCA so far. So what we'll do is we'll launch the polls now, and as you see in your screen, the first poll is, how confident are you in interacting / communicating with the FCA? Now, if you can please provide your answers to that, we'll give it 5-10 more seconds, and then we will share the results. Let's go ahead and share those results now, please. Brilliant, thank you. So, Lorraine, Anthony, any comments on the results that are on screen at the moment?
Yeah, it's quite interesting with almost the sort of same number of very confident versus very unconfident. But I think it's quite encouraging. I mean, 29% is not a bad number that are confident in dealing with the regulator. But equally, there's a number that are clearly unconfident, and that's where I think most of our clients really sit within that sort of bucket. Feeling not very excited to have to interact with the FCA and get a little bit worried about how's best to do that. So, yeah, Anthony, any views on that?
I think looking at the neutral category as well, 50% of people aren't sure whether they'd be good at interacting or not, which is maybe because they haven't had the chance to do so, which is probably a good thing from their perspective. But as and when that does come, I think a lot of the tips we'll discuss in the next half an hour or so will be very, very useful for that. So big portion, nearly 50% is kind of unsure. So
yeah, maybe that's because they've not had any dealings with the regulator at all. So, you know, which is quite often the case. So they're really not sure. But in any case, what we're going to go through today will help you should that occasion ever arise, I guess.
Thank you very much. And let's just launch our second poll here. Give me 2 seconds. And here's the question for you. How prepared are you now should the FCA knock on your door today? Again, 5 potential answers. If you can please let us know. We'll give it 5 to 10 more seconds, and then we'll close, share the results, briefly discuss them, and then dive into the real meat of today's session, which is going to be the panel discussion. So let's go ahead and close that poll now and share the results. Interesting.
Well, it's good to see that almost 50% of our participants feel that they are prepared, and I think that's excellent news. Obviously, being prepared for the regulator in advance of them ever coming to ask any questions is a good thing. So that's quite good to see, actually. Anything you would add to that?
I think that's probably fair. I think, but also 50% are unsure. And again, that might be because they haven't had the FCA knocking at their door. They're not sure what kind of questions the FCA will be asking for. But again, that's something that we can certainly unpack today and try and figure out and give some hints and tips as to what might be best if that does happen.
Perfect. So thank you everyone who responded in these polls. Now, with this in mind, I'm going to start and dive into our questions now. So, Anthony, with your background at the FCA, I'd like to ask you, what is the key thing you suggest when interacting with the regulator?
So I think you kind of touched on this a little bit in your introduction, but just to double down on it, your kind of openness and honesty with the regulators and absolute non-negotiable from my perspective, and something that, you know, I was part to both good and bad at the regulator. So apart from being a key pillar of your conditions for authorization, if you mislead the regulator and that leads to bigger consequences further down the line, which the FCA should have known about, but you decided not to inform them, then their attitude towards your firm is going to be a lot harsher than it would have been in the first place if you'd just been upfront with them if something had gone wrong. From my experience, firms that thought they'd be able to get away with a particular issue, more often than not, didn't. And something else led the FCA to finding out about the issue in the first place anyway. So it's always important just to be as open and honest and disclose things as soon as possible with the regulator.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So as a firm that has had not much or any interaction with the FCA previously, should we be concerned or should they actually be concerned if the FCA is suddenly reaching out to them? And conversely, if they've never heard from the FCA, would that be a good thing?
I think that actually depends. So if, for example, I don't know, let's say you had a spike in your complaints, maybe the FCA's picked up in some adverse media about your business, or in fact, maybe there's been a whistleblowing notification, something to do with poor conduct within your firm, for example, then perhaps yes. But if it were related to maybe something that's more sort of sector-wide, like a survey, consultation, thematic review, then not so much. But how you respond, especially in respect of that thematic review and response, would be super important. I would say, really, in the spirit of no news is good news. If you've not had any direct interest by the FCA in your business, then, you know, take that as a win, really. However, there is always the risk, and you never know when that day may come, when the FCA is perhaps looking for some information, or something to do with your compliance framework, the systems and controls, and therefore, and this is why we asked the question about how prepared are you, because you need to make sure that everything, your house is in order and everything is up to date. Really, there would be no time for sort of like saying, well, wait, let me come back to you whilst we get that sorted. And I've maybe put this into a real life example that we've experienced with one of our clients, where the firm actually did have a bit of a spike in their volume of clients that they were onboarding, which kind of caught the FCA's eyes and then led them to look at the business more closely to understand, well, exactly what's happening there. As a result, the FCA started requesting copies of the firm's policies and procedures, and unfortunately, they were not immediately available because some of the policies they were asking for, they just didn't have, and others just weren't up to date and in line with existing regulation. So luckily we were able to sort of jump in and help them remedy that in very quickly in time for them to respond to the request. But the sort of I used to be a girl guide and used to say, like, be prepared. And I think that's really the mantra I would suggest every regulated firm has. So yeah.
Just to add to that as well, and I wasn't in the girl guides, but the FCA might start to ask a lot of prudential questions out of nowhere. That's likely due to if you're coming close to your capital requirement, or if the FCA has identified that your firm is loss making. So if you can clearly articulate why that might be the case, and suggest potential remedies, or even if you've invested in new controls and resources to combat a particular issue, which explains why the losses might be incurred, then that can certainly paint you in a more positive light than kind of panicking and not really seeing why the FCA are asking that question.
Perfect. So would it look bad if a firm were to ask for clarification from the FCA if they were unsure what the FCA were actually asking for?
Go on.
Sorry, to jump in. I wouldn't say it would look bad at all. No, I think you can ask for clarification just to make sure that the information you're about to give, or the response you're going to give, is the right one. Then the FCA don't always make it clear, so we've seen that ourselves. But I think it's always good to remember that you need to sort of remain sort of aware of what that actual request is, and be quite considered in your response. Sorry, Anthony, I jumped in.
No, that's fine. I think there's certain things that it wouldn't look good to ask clarification on. So things that are absolutely concrete in either your application status or your ongoing status as a regulated firm. So things like your capital requirement, your obligations to safeguard, kind of what the roles of key personnel are, that sort of thing. But if it's some terminology in an email that you're not entirely sure what they mean, and it's not something you've come across before, I think that's perfectly fine to just ask for a clarification. That's what they're asking for there. Before you ask for any clarification, though, I think it's just worth asking yourself, taking a pause and saying, is this something I should know? Because if it is, and you're asking the FCA for it, that isn't going to look particularly good for you guys if it's something that you should be well aware of as a hopefully all regulated firm.
Great. So another question here. So can a firm challenge the FCA? So, for example, in a meeting or an email communication, and refer to previous correspondence that they've had?
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to jump in this time. Yes, you absolutely can. But always remember to be considered, be reasonable, and of course, always be non-confrontational in that interaction. I think it's always good to, acknowledge the FCA's position on the matter, but you want to provide maybe your own evidence that maybe relates to your perspective, for example. I think it's important thing is whatever you put forward, just make sure that it is realistic. And I would also remember that often the FCA keep records on previous interactions with you. So they may be looking, for example, at previous data points that you've provided. So anything that you say, you need to make sure is sort of up to date, non-conflicting with that information that they may already hold. Sometimes we are asked by a client to help them answer specific questions that the FCA have posed. which on the face of it often looks quite straightforward, right? So it looks like a very straightforward request, but just based on our experience and exposure and insight, I guess, to what the FCA's or how the FCA's mind's working, sometimes we think, actually, do you know what, we know where this question's going. It's not as black and white as it looks. There's something a bit more behind this, and therefore how you answer that is super important. So we would strongly recommend that, you know, should you decide to challenge the FCA, that you have all your facts straight. Maybe you seek advice or clarification, whether it's from your legal or regulatory consultant or someone else that's your advisor, just to make sure that there's nothing there that you perhaps are missing. The number of times that we've seen clients come to us with hey, we've got this question from the FCA and this is how we're going to answer. And we're like, no, stop, thank goodness because you're about to open a whole can of worms here and it's not going to look good for you. And then we sort of counsel them in a sort of slightly a different approach and way to respond to that question. So I think it's super important to really be considered before you answer.
Brilliant. So when interacting with the FCA, what can firms do to impress the regulator and alleviate any concerns that they may have?
Okay, so always respond promptly. Okay, so I think the quicker, so if you've taken too long to respond, the regulator's going to get a little bit nervous that maybe things aren't, you know, you're digging around for the information and or anything else that they're asking you for. I think obviously always take things seriously. Sometimes we would advise firms to have available like supporting information, like maybe you've had a recent audit completed, for example, make sure, as I mentioned earlier, you have all your policies and procedures in place, just so that you're able to indicate that actually, you know, you've taken steps to identify and adequately manage any sort of risks to your business and you're aware of what's going on. Definitely, and most importantly, don't try in any way, don't try and misrepresent or tweak anything, just always the truth, because you know the truth will always come out and it'll look really super bad for you if you've tried to bend that slightly. Always be consistent, but as I've said already, be aware of what information you may have already previously given the regulator. Another thing I would suggest is that if they are interviewing multiple stakeholders in your business, make sure they're aligned. And we've seen this firsthand where what's being said over here in one interview is completely different from what someone else is saying on the same topic. Also be sure that you know who in the firm is responsible for what. Other things you could do is make sure that you've got a compliance voice on the board and that all senior managers understand the firm's regulatory obligations. They should know all about this, particularly in relation to their specific role and their areas of responsibility. And I think specifically for fast growth businesses, just make sure that your compliance arrangements are reviewed and are keeping pace with your commercial growth, because that's something that definitely the FCA are really kind of keen to see happening, and that would look good for you if you're already kind of preempting that and being proactive in that regard, I would say.
I think just to add to that as well, I think if you can be just one step ahead of the regulator in general, and if there's an issue and you can say to them, we're aware of this issue, we've already done X, Y, Z to address this issue before they even reach out to you. That's actually quite impressive from their perspective, because I think you'd be amazed how many times that isn't the case, and the FCA are the ones informing you of a problem with your own business when you should know it. So if the FCA, like I say, if the FCA are the ones informing you of your own issue, then that's not exactly going to inspire confidence. I also think that every person in the call, kind of touching on what Lorraine said, in the meeting should have clear knowledge of things like how the firm makes its money, what the business model is, who their customers are, and what kind of risks sit with that customer base, because the FCA is only going to get tighter and more closer on things like consumer duty and their approach to vulnerable customers. So they might just drop a question in around what you're doing to kind of implement that and show that you're putting customers first in that sense as well.
So when a firm is interacting with DA when relating potential restrictions, such as like a VREC, an OIREC, etc., is the FCA likely to come in with a preconceived idea of what they believe the outcome to be? What are your views here?
Yeah, Yeah, I think the FCA most of the times have a baseline of what they know is going to be acceptable. So, for example, they may suggest an OIREC, which is an FCA imposed restriction, so it's a bit more serious that they might want to impose. When in fact they might be quite happy with the VREC, which is a more voluntary restriction that you as a firm would put forward. So in that case, you know what, there's also always room for discussion with the regulator. I think a lot of firms fear putting their case forward to the regulator, and I'm not saying you argue your case, argue is the wrong word, but present your case, probably a better word. And I don't see why you shouldn't do that and try to almost negotiate with them in terms of where you should land. And why wouldn't you want to support your case? It's your business at the end of the day that this is going to impact. So I think, yeah, I would definitely think they've got an agenda, and you need to think carefully about how you're dealing with that or responding to that.
I would caveat that by saying that if you're saying to the FCA, you know, things aren't as bad as you think, I would make sure that that is actually the case, because if you've got a plan in place to remediate particular items, the next time the FCA come asking questions, they're going to want to see that plan has been acted and issues aren't as bad as they were previously. So in that time frame, if things get worse, when you've said, you know, it's not as bad as you think, we can sort this sort of thing, you won't really have a leg to stand on the next time the FCA start asking for restrictions, because they've given you a chance, you haven't taken it, and in that case, you know, they can be pretty harsh with restrictions, and there's not really a lot you can do in that instance. But they are reasonable if you can demonstrate that, you know, their data perhaps around an issue is out of date, what has happened in the intervening time has changed, they kind of move the goalposts a little bit. I think that is worth a discussion, but make sure you are doing what you say you're doing, otherwise that'll land you in hot water.
So when should a firm notify the FCA of an issue or an internal change to their business?
Immediately, I would say. And certainly without much delay. I mean, that's really part of your requirements as an authorised firm. And I think even if you think it's a small matter, just let the FCA be the judge of that. If you've notified them, quite often firms will say to me, should I say tell the FCA this thing? And I say, yeah, tell them that thing. And you know what, the FCA take it and go, park it. A lot of times they don't hear anything back, nothing happens, but at least you've done what you need to do, and you can sleep at night, right? The problem is if you don't do that, and then the matter kind of escalates, it gets worse over time, and then you think, okay, right, actually, this is a big deal. We absolutely need to tell the FCA, or the FCA find out about it in some other means. That's going to absolutely look a lot worse for your firm. As I sort of mentioned earlier, always be open and honest with the regulators and all your interactions. I think that's the best stance, really. Quite often, just again, based on experience, a firm sometimes thinks, you know what, this will be a quick fix, we can sort that, it doesn't really matter, we don't need to notify. And of course, it depends on the severity of the thing. It's hard to call it right now. But if that quick fix doesn't work, and then you think, all right, okay, we can't sort it, the FCA get to know about it, then it's just going to look bad for you, because they're going to say, okay, so when did you first recognise this? And you're going to say, well, oh, actually, it was away back then, last year, whenever. And then they're going to question why you didn't inform them. And that's definitely a more difficult hole, I would say, to dig yourself out of. So, I mean, if in doubt, we're always here to advise, of course, but I think the best policy is just be open and honest. Yeah.
So let's work with the scenario now. So you're a firm and you have the FCA coming in for, let's say, a first visit. What, if anything, would the FCA want to understand about the firm's business model when they meet them?
So I touched on a few of these earlier, but the key areas would be what the firm does, who their customers are, what the risks are associated with A, their customers, and B, their business model. Whoever is answering those questions need to be clear and articulate with their responses. They also, as Lorraine mentioned earlier on, need to be consistent across the board if there's multiple people having conversations with the FCA. And again, all of the meetings with the FCA are recorded, so you need to remember the FCA will have records of a previous conversation which they can refer to when they're unsure about if there's kind of a correlation between the people they're speaking to. It's also likely that if it's someone that you haven't heard from previously at the FCA, the supervisor might not know anything about your firm at all. So the easiest way that they can find out about your firm is for you to tell them. That's not necessarily a trick question in any sense. It's just to save time backwards and forwards in email trying to find out what exactly your firm does. But if you can't explain it very well, then there's kind of cause for concern around the fitness and propriety of yourself if you don't know what it is that your firm is doing. I know that kind of sounds crazy, but it's something that I've seen where a firm hasn't been able to articulate how it operates, which, as you can imagine, caused a bit of a red flag for the FCA and kind of led to further questions on that front as well.
Perfect. How likely would it be that an interaction with the FCA leads to, further questioning or further engagement with the firm?
So that kind of depends on how well you address the initial matter that they ask questions on. I think this might answer one of the questions that's coming in the sidebar as well. So if they're happy with your initial response, if they're not happy with your initial response, it might lead to further questions. Generally, the FCA will be contacting you about a specific issue, whether that's kind of prudential or whether it's a conduct issue, a financial promotions issue, or financial crime issue. Their initial line of questioning will directly relate to that topic. However, if a response to their questions kind of raises concerns in another area, don't be surprised if you get a barrage of questions associated with that as well. So, for example, a firm I was working with in my time at the FCA got confused between their company accounts and their safeguarding accounts. So what would have been fairly routine interaction around like their capital status and what they were doing to maintain that and bulk it up in a certain instance turned into a big discussion around their safeguarding. And it turned out that they weren't safeguarding correctly. So that could have been avoided. But, they weren't entirely sure of what they should have been speaking about. So didn't exactly do themselves any favors. When it comes to an FCA kind of ticking off and closing a case, they'll do what's known as a holistic assessment on a firm, which is kind of a review of everything that's out there open source wise. So things like media, any complaints, any reviews. And then they also look at internal data on prudential position, which they'll get from your reg data submissions and any other cases that the FCA has open against the firm. So my advice would be to answer the question that they've asked, but keep within the boundaries of that topic, rather than expanding and potentially causing yourself further issues that you hadn't planned for and weren't expecting to be discussing.
Yeah, if I could maybe just jump in really, really quickly on that one as well. I think, and I mentioned earlier, I think it's how you answer the question. Like when I said, a client said, I'm going to say this, and we say, no, stop, because that's going to open this can of worms. You don't want to say it like that, or you don't want to mention that, because sometimes you've got to answer the question. And sometimes if you start, because you're trying to be super helpful, but if you say too much, you're just leading them down a road and through a door you'd rather have closed. And I'm not suggesting for any minute, by the way, that we're trying to be duplicitous or lie to the regulator. That's not what I'm saying. But I think answer what's being asked and sort of leave it at that. But how you answer, the way you sort of generate that response is also very important. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
So can firms ask for an agenda before a meeting or a call with the FCA?
Yes, you absolutely can. In fact, you absolutely should, because you want to. I think two things it does. I think it's really important that you then bring the right people to the table for that meeting. So understanding what kind of topics it is they want to talk about would allow you to make sure that you've got the right information to your hands to answer those questions, and also that you've got the right people, as I said, to be prepared to respond to that. I think, it's a really good means of gauging or getting an indication in terms of what to expect from the call or the meeting if it's in person, and just helps you build your case ahead of that. So I'd absolutely encourage you to get such. They're not often they don't often volunteer one, the FCA, but I think you're well within your rights to ask for one.
Yeah, definitely. They're not necessarily going to be a detailed agenda, but any information you can get up front, which is a perfectly reasonable request, will certainly just aid you, assist your preparation for the call as well.
So when having calls or meetings with the FCA, who should be involved in these? And do the FCA need to know who is going to be involved or joining a call or meeting, for example, like a third party, such as a compliance or legal advisor, etc.?
So the FCA, in terms of who needs to be on the call from your business side, the FCA normally make the decision on that, but typically it's the CEO, MLRO, head of compliance, those types of roles, unless there's a good reason why they want to speak to someone else. Really, when they're having these interactions with you, the important thing for them is to understand how your firm's customers are protected. How good is your compliance framework? So whoever joins this call really needs to be in touch with that. They need to be adequately explaining that. Of course, you can always have your advisor in attendance. I mean, we do that for many of our clients. We're kind of silent partners, though. We can't give an opinion, or we can't really sort of answer the questions for you in any way. But I think it's important that we're there. We could pick up on something that the FCA may be questioning or saying that might not be immediately apparent to who's on the call, because quite often you're focused on just making sure you're giving the right answers. You don't see the little bits around that. At the very least, it allows you to have a separate record of the conversation. The FCA absolutely should be taking a record of that conversation. But I've seen one occasion where they said they didn't have a transcript, and it was put the firm in a very difficult position. So having us as an extra pair of eyes and ears is really good. However, I think you just need to, you would always ask the FCA's permission as such, or advise them that people like ourselves are going to be joining. I think that's just sort of out of politeness, more than anything else. I mean, I was involved with a firm that joined the call with several lawyers with them by their side, without letting the FCA know that was actually the case. And that, for me, just presented the firm in a poor light in a couple of ways. And it instantly gives the regulator the impression that, okay, what's going on? This firm's got something to hide, or got something to be worried about or cautious about. They've got all their lawyers here to protect them. And B, it just sets the wrong tone of the regulator, and what could have been just a very simple and relatively routine call. So I think you've got to be really careful and just always be upfront with the regulator in terms of who's joining.
Yeah, just very quickly, sorry. Often in my time at the FCA, the firms we'd see lawyering up would be the ones that, like you say, had something to hide, were, the ones who had all the issues, the ones who, brought their CEO, head of compliance along to a call, were aware of what was going on, didn't necessarily think they needed to go for that kind of legal position, were the ones who didn't necessarily have to worry about. So kind of a position as to how you put yourself with the FCA, and like Lorraine says, it can give an impression that might not necessarily be the case, but it's kind of what they think and will shape a lot of their views going forward as well.
So I know we're coming towards the end of our scheduled questions before we open up to our audience, but I'd like to give both of you a chance to sort of go through potentially some do's and don'ts, or maybe examples of good and bad practice when engaging with the regulator.
Yeah, I'm happy to go through. I'll go through that at a very high level, though, just to sake of time. I think we've got a few questions that would be good to answer. But if anyone wants any further detail on this, of course, you can contact us, and happy to provide that. But I think in terms of the views, look, be open and transparent in your communication. I think that goes without saying. The important thing is to evidence that you've cultivated a culture of compliance, that sort of strong compliance culture within your firm, with the senior management setting the tone, of course. Stay informed and updated. It's very, very important that you keep abreast of regulatory changes and updates, because if you're called to interview with the FCA, they would expect you to know this stuff. Take a proactive approach to the regulations. So, you want to always be up to date with your risk assessments, be prepared with your documentation, as we've mentioned, and always be collaborative and cooperative with the FCA. And if, by the way, you need to seek guidance on how best to do that, then of course, absolutely, you can do that. In terms of what not to do, and I think that's just the opposite of everything I just said, really, don't conceal, don't misrepresent information. I'll guarantee you it'll come out in the wash, and that is going to be your downfall, no matter what else you've done. Ignoring regulatory change will put you in the sort of back foot with the regulator, because you're then likely to have out-of-date policies and procedures as a result. Do not underestimate regulatory impact. So avoid underestimating sort of financial and reputational consequences of non-compliance, and making sure you've got the resource, and being reactive instead of being proactive, and waiting for regulatory issues to arise before taking action is probably not a good thing. And I think just a clear lack of respect or cooperation with the regulator will absolutely get you front and centre with them. So I think these are all pretty common sense things, but actually some firms do make some of these mistakes, believe it or not. But I think they would be sort of high level do's and don'ts.
I guess just from my experience, examples of when it's gone very well from an interaction perspective, and when it hasn't gone so well is, example of good communication and good interaction from my perspective was a large API that I'd been the supervisor for had a kind of spike in their APP fraud cases. They'd proactively reached out to the FCA to say, look, we've had this, you should expect a lot of complaints coming through to you over the next few weeks. That was the case, but the firm had already laid out a clear plan to address the issues in place and had already been working through it. So that was largely a hands-off approach from the FCA in that instance, because the firm had been proactive, they'd reached out to us ahead of time. It wasn't the case of the FCA having to inform them of an issue, it was the other way around. And that was very much let the firm get on with it. Alternatively, I was supervising a firm who were known to have poor controls relating to their customer onboarding and were already subject to the Section 166 because of that. During the Section 166 engagements, the firm failed to disclose that it had significant liquidity issues. I think the firm were expecting to have an investment round to remedy this, but that fell through at the last minute. So that goes back to the point we discussed earlier on about, if you think it's going to be a quick fix, there's no need to tell the FCA. That quick fix didn't happen, and the FCA subsequently found out about that via a whistleblowing individual from that firm. That then meant that the firm was subject to more restrictions. It wasn't allowed to do any more business. It was placed on the FCA's watch list and actually came very close to insolvency because A, it wasn't allowed to do any more business, and the investment round had fallen through as well. So I think the FCA understands that occasionally issues occur. That's kind of business and that's life, but how a firm deals with them and how they communicate them is a clear sign of what type of firm the FCA are going to be dealing with and whether they need to pay particular attention to that firm or not.
So thanks very much to both of you, Lorraine and Anthony. Let's ask some of the questions that have come in from the attendees today. We'll go through them in order here now. So in the case of a company that is regulated by the CBI as well as the FCA, is it fair to assume that the FCA is made aware of the CBI, made aware by the CBI of latest events and interactions with them?
No. Often departments within the FCA don't communicate effectively with each other, so I wouldn't necessarily expect another regulator to be communicating with the FCA effectively. If it's something massive, then there may have been something put across, but I wouldn't expect the FCA to know much or anything at all about what you're doing in another jurisdiction, because it's just not of their concern. There might have been a cursory update from one side to the other, but no, I don't think that would be safe to assume.
Is the dawn raid still an FCA tactic? So have they been using it much recently, to your knowledge?
So in my time at the FCA, and I was in the payments and emoney supervision team for just short of 3 years, there was one, albeit a lot of that time was during COVID. So, that wasn't necessarily something they were able to do at the time. It's not a commonly used tactic, principally because of the way everyone works now. It's very easy to just get someone on the phone, get someone on a Teams call and kind of have a chat that way. Firm visits are a thing. If there's concerns around your firm, the FCA will come and look, but I think they're more likely to kind of articulate those concerns before they come and have a word with you and come and have an explore of what you're doing. But that's not to say that they can't use the dawn raid. It's just not something that they tend to use very regularly anymore.
Do you get credit for responding quickly and ahead of deadlines, or does it not really matter that much?
So it depends what you mean by deadlines, I guess. If you're talking about regulatory returns, then there is a deadline for responding to them. If you're consistently late with those, I would imagine anything that brings you to the attention of the regulator is going to want them to wonder what's going on. And I can't remember who said this within the FCA exactly, but they pretty much said that trust us, and this is particular to payments, this quote, but they said, like, if we find one issue with your business, we're going to open the bonnet and we're going to look underneath to see what else is going on, because it raises a red flag to us. So things like being late with that, just maybe you don't, they'll think maybe you don't have the right resources, maybe you don't have the right culture, whatever else, or the information to your fingertips. So it's not generally a good thing. But if you respond on time, I don't think they're going to think, oh wow, you're amazing, you respond in time. They're just going to think, you know what, you're doing what you've been asked to do. If it's a deadline for information other than a regulatory sort of reg data piece, but they've asked for information, I think it is always very good to make sure. We always encourage firms to have a deadline before the deadline. So make sure that because what you want to do is prove to the FCA that actually you have this stuff at your fingertips and that you're ready and you're prepared and your business is in order, like we've mentioned already. So I think that would definitely go in your favour, as opposed to being like midnight on the day that you're supposed to get it in, for example, would not look so good for you.
Really obvious thing to say as well, but don't rush whatever you're trying to get back to the FCA. So best to just use their deadline as an indicator. Pointless sending something back to them a week early if it's not complete, because then you're just going to get asked again, and just, you know, it's not a good idea. So just, if you're going to do it right, and if you want to do it early, then fine, but make sure you do it right in the first place.
I know this is probably a question that we've probably covered across a few different questions so far, but how would it be best to be proactive with the FCA? How to communicate best with them? So
I think often the best way to do communication is, if you're kind of and ahhing as to whether it's something that you need to communicate to the FCA, let them know, and then let them be the judge of whether it's something they want to pay more attention to. If something happens in the organisation, you haven't informed the FCA, and your reasoning behind that is, oh, we didn't think it was important, and then, you know, XYZ has followed that, that's not really going to wash. Whereas it's best to just say, look, this has happened, do you want any more information on it? In terms of like the best way to communicate, you're talking about a particular channel, it doesn't really matter. The FCA is open to having a phone call or an email exchange. It doesn't really matter from their perspective, but things we touched on around being prompt with your responses, being clear in your responses, seeking clarification early rather than seeking clarification the day before a deadline, because that doesn't look particularly good if you're kind of asking for potentially more time to cover something that you could have asked for 2 or 3 weeks earlier. So yeah, I think being proactive is the key thing, and letting the FCA decide if there's an issue. That's kind of up to them to do so. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think what you've said is, yeah, totally spot on.
I think we've got time for one last question. I think it's actually been covered partly in question 9 that I asked you earlier, but the question came in: do you have any key considerations that firms should be aware of when trying to balance the need to answer the FCA questions openly and honestly against the need to prevent the FCA picking up on information that could open up a new direction for their questioning and protecting the business from further time and cost burdens? And I know we answered it partly before, but I was wondering if you had anything more you'd like to say on it.
I mean, I don't think anything more than we've just already said. I think it's a really good question to ask, though, because there is a fine line to be drawn between giving enough information and not over-egging the pudding, so to speak, and giving information that the FCA aren't really asking for, because in responses we've seen that firms are proposing to send to the FCA, it's just way too much. It's taken the FCA down another avenue that they might not even be thinking about or sort of open to hearing about at that point. But you're opening the door for them and letting them through. Just answer succinctly, answer the question. If you've not answered it enough, they'll come back for clarification. but keep it short and sweet, really, I think.
Yeah, it is a fine balance because you don't want to leave it undercooked
No.
a little bit. But like you say, you don't want to write War and Peace, and then the FCA won't want to read that. They'll ask for it to be resubmitted, most likely, which won't particularly help you very much. So I guess that's around specifically understanding the question that's been asked. So if you need to see clarification, then do so, because otherwise, pointless answering something if you're not so sure what it is. But yeah, I stick to the brief, as they say in exams. Only answer the question. Don't draw attention to other areas, particularly if it's not something that you as an individual in the firm knows too much about.
Absolutely. And I think, it sounds, you would think, they're asking a question and it should be a straightforward answer. But as I've said, sometimes it's not that black and white. And when we see the question and we see the firm's response, we very often encourage the firm to answer slightly differently, because we can read between the lines and we know that they're asking that question because they're possibly worried about this. We had an example very recently where they asked for specific piece of information which looked very straightforward, but we, having had history in the business, realised where they were angling on this, and a slightly different response was required to because sometimes what the FCA are doing is they're trying to give you the opportunity to kind of redeem yourself, but without asking you to do so. So without saying, we're worried about this, how are you doing on that? They want you to be giving them the information before they ask, because then they think, right, okay, we know this firm knows what they're doing, but sometimes it's a hidden message. But they want you to give them the right answer, but without asking a direct question, because that would give the game away, so to speak, because it should be something you're aware of. And I think these are the kind of things that we often pick up on that the firm doesn't, I would say.
Yeah, cool.
So we've covered a lot here today. And in summary, your firm should really approach interactions with the FCA with transparency, compliance, mindedness, and a cooperative spirit. Avoiding concealment, ignoring regulations, and underestimating the impact of non-compliance are crucial. By proactively engaging with the FCA and adhering to regulatory guidelines, firms can maintain a positive regulatory relationship and minimize the risk of enforcement actions. I'd like to thank all of our attendees on today's session for taking the time to join us for this really interesting discussion. I really hope you have found it as interesting as I have done. And I'd like to also thank Anthony and Lorraine for joining us as well. This session has been recorded and we'll be putting the recording online soon. Please follow Thistle Initiatives on LinkedIn to see when that becomes available. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.